Fred, as a former college president, former dean of a law school, and now as the CEO of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, which has chapters on 290 college and university campuses across the country, what are the issues that are emerging for you as we see this crisis unfold?
Thanks, Lynn. And I think Mary has actually given us a pretty good list to start with of the things that she's worried about. The things that the president is worried about is the things that the general counsel or the outside counsel should be helping the president think through and be concerned with. I know from years as a law professor, one technique I've used when a student is really stumped with a question, rather than just asking the question a second time, which is your temptation, is to go into it a side way by saying, what makes this question hard? And sometimes that lets them into it a different way. So I just want to take the first minute of my comments on what makes this one hard. And it's sort of obvious in a way, but maybe it bears just looking at a little bit. Part of what we do when we try to make policy judgments as administrators or legal judgments as lawyers is look for patterns we can recognize. Where have I seen something like this? Where did I get it right when I did that? What did I not do as well as I wanted to? What can I learn from that? And there are pieces of that here to be sure, but this is so different from anything that anybody has seen that it's very frustrating for many of us in terms of trying to draw on what the pattern is. It's a little like 08, 09. I was president of Brandeis when we were in lockdown for 24 hours after the Boston Marathon bombing, but that was a 24-hour lockdown. It seemed awfully serious at the time, and it was awfully serious at the time, but it had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it had a specific moment when we could say, and it's done, the all clear sounded. So it's very hard to recognize what the patterns are. The other thing that we like to do as administrators and as lawyers giving advice is to make sure that we have all the facts that we need in order to give advice and make a decision. Well, that's almost impossible to do in this situation. And for some obvious reasons and less obvious reasons. Obvious reasons that things are changing all the time. The fact that if you just think back about where you were 2 months ago in your own life, for most of us, we were not quarantined or really even thinking deeply about what a quarantine situation would look like. So now we're trying to project out 2 months, 4 months, 6 months. Very hard to know how things are going to continue to change. And then the other problem, of course, is that there are literally unpredictable pieces of this. Mary's good questions about what are our obligations on campus, what can we do on campus, but that also begs the question of, suppose we do all of those things to the very best of our ability. Are students going to come? Are parents still going to say, under the circumstances, I respect everything you've done and all the decisions you've made, we're going to sit it out for a year? I think we always think about these things in terms of some give and take over the summer melt in admissions that we're all familiar with. But we're going to potentially see numbers of summer melts that we've never seen before. So again, these are unknowable things, and that's part of what makes this hard, is that we're just not playing with the kind of information we're used to or pattern recognition that we're used to. Let me set out a couple of categories of issues that I'm seeing talking to our chapter officers, but also universities where I'm in touch. And Lynn, as you mentioned, Phi Beta Kappa's got 290 chapters, but it's an astonishingly diverse group of schools. It's big schools, small schools, it's publics, it's privates, it's east, south, north, and west. So in that variety, certain trends do emerge. One, which is an ongoing matter, of course, are issues of refunds and controlling your own budget when there are issues of refunds with respect to room and board, also tuition. I know Paul's going to talk in his presentation a little bit about the class action suits. I just want to mention here that we're in an interesting place of an intersection of law and policy in a way. Legally, there are obligations that the university owes to its students. When you admit a student, there is a contract of sorts that exists between the student and the university. The student has certain obligations, so does the university. If you're not going to provide those services, do you have to refund room and board? The answer in most schools have hit is yes. Tuition, most schools have said no, I think for good and certain reasons, but that's going to continue to play out as a challenge. That's just the legal side of it. There are non-legal obligations that we owe to our students as well, and there are public relations aspects of how we act in this. So where many schools are finding themselves tied in knots right now is that we have all said for so long that what we do in the classroom, what we do on campus, what we do in the informal settings is so much superior to distance learning. And now here we are in a world of distance learning. So how can we at the same time say that we're providing the same kind of education? Well, even if it's not that, can we say we're making our best efforts for it? It's a nuanced conversation, and we're living in a time where nuance is hard to come by. So I think that is both a legal question and a broader policy type question that has to be confronted. Two broad scenarios. What are we thinking about as schools consider returning to campus, and what are we thinking about as we remain remote? So let me just set out a couple of ideas in each of those. As we talk about returning to campus, there is, of course, the overarching obligation to provide a safe campus and a safe learning environment. That's for your students, but it's also for your faculty, and it's also for your staff. That means that as people return to campus, what social distancing opportunities mean is going to be a big challenge for schools. And Mary raises a good question when she says, if it's foreseeable that students aren't going to abide by those, to what extent does the university or the college become responsible for that? The fact that everybody gets a single doesn't mean that there isn't that shared bathroom on the floor. And to what extent, by having provided that, are you liable? In terms of faculty, many of your faculty members are in at-risk groups, even if they don't have compromised systems. They're 60 years of age and older. So the very fact that you've got a lot of your faculty who are in a situation that they legally might have a right not to be in a live classroom, that's going to have the obligation of a university when returning to this. Let me raise a sort of an issue here, which may lead to odd coalitions. There is going to be discussion on Capitol Hill this week about the next COVID stimulus package that will include, among other things, an effort overwhelmingly from the Republican side of the House to get liability waivers for businesses as people return to work. There will be pressure within the higher education community for us to be part of that, and for universities and colleges to also seek liability waivers for people returning to campus. The legal side of the House may wish that. The academic side of the House may have some real resistance in that. And I would suspect on many of your campuses, you're going to have students who would not be happy with that. So that is going to be a very complicated issue, which shows the blend of the university as a organization, but a special kind of organization. We're not just any other kind of company. We're in the business of education and transmitting knowledge that we create and discover. So that's going to be a complicated issue, is where we should be on waiver of liability. If, on the other hand, campuses remain remote in total or even in part, there are continuing obligations, first of all, to students who can't go home. Now, as we move further along, that's going to become less and less clear that the school continues to have those obligations. After all, an international student who couldn't get home in March, by some point come the summertime, may no longer be the school's legal obligation. That doesn't mean the school doesn't have some kind of a non-legal or ethical obligation to those students. But that will continue to be a challenge. And of course, if the school remains in a virtual remote format, all federal regulations continue still to apply, harassment protections, and particularly Title IX, that I know Paul is going to talk about some new developments that could be coming to us in Title IX right away. But the very fact that students are not physically on your campus does not remove any of those obligations and legal obligations. So it's a thicket right now of issues that the university is going to have to be taking on, regardless of what choices it makes. Let me think of it first from the point of view of an administrator anticipating what parents are going to be asking. I used to, near the end of my orientation address, after I talked to the students quite a bit, I'd look out at the parents and I'd say in a word to the parents, thank you for trusting us with your children. It's a sacred trust and we take it as such. And I knew the kids were rolling their eyes when I did that. The parents, by and large, were not rolling their eyes. That was hard news programming for them. I bet, by the way, that the students would not be rolling their eyes so much now. I think we sort of understand this in a different way. So I start with that because I think the importance for administrations, deans of admissions, presidents, provosts, to be demonstrating why we are a place you should trust your children to be at. That's why I would suggest as a framing, not this discussion of we're going to open in the fall and here's how we're going to do it, but rather we are committed to having our students back on campus just as soon as it's safe. That's the goal. That's what we're going to get to. Now, we have to figure out how are we going to get there. And we're going to make it the very best experience we can between now and then to get there. And then I think now to come to the parent side is to listen to what the institution is saying. Is this a place that has my child's interests at mind, that is going to balance the safety concerns along with the education concerns? And is this a place where I want to continue to be part of it? So you're going to make a decision in June as a parent, knowing almost full well that it's based on incomplete information, that by the time it actually has to be executed on come August or September, things are going to have changed in all sorts of ways. So at that point, it's got to be, this is a school that I trust. If you really don't have that level of trust as a parent, then I think taking the year off and letting things settle down makes a lot of sense. So that makes it quite incumbent on the institution to say, here are the things we're thinking about for the fall. Here are the variables. Just take one quick one that's an easy one. If you listen carefully to almost everything that's being said about reopening, it presupposes a level of testing that is, I will say, at least ambitious. Testing both for the antibodies, but even just testing for the virus. I didn't say it's impossible. I just said it's ambitious. So you have to ask yourself as a parent, is this an environment that I'm comfortable putting my child into, both if it's successful and if, God forbid, it's not? And I think a lot of that comes back to, can the school demonstrate that level of trust to merit the child going off to that school? As a practical matter, this is where testing becomes absolutely essential, and I think in some ways may be the hurdle to most of the plans that are going to go into effect come this fall. Some way of knowing who we are bringing onto campus. And your questioner asked about coming from different states, assuming that the borders open up again and international students can return, which we all think is an important thing, both for philosophical reasons. We've globalized the American campus. It's been one of the great transformative experiences of the last decade or so, as well as the income stream of those international students. But international students just takes that problem and makes it even greater. So I think in all those cases, the campus is going to have to deal, yes, with federal rules, but also with its own state and perhaps local municipal rules. And it seems to me there's no way that's going to be able to be accomplished without a pretty rigorous regime of testing for COVID-19. The fact is, the class action suits about refunding tuition from the spring, it's the right answer to the wrong question. If what they're saying is, going forward, can universities and colleges continue to charge the same levels of tuition for a different kind of program? I think that's a very active question. And I think a lot of universities and colleges right now are struggling with what is the cost structure going to be to bring in the needed net tuition revenue come the fall. That's a different question from, did you fulfill your legal obligation in the spring, given a major force majeure set of circumstances that nobody could have anticipated, where your ongoing obligation is to provide the best education under the circumstances you possibly can. I think most colleges and universities will be able to meet that standard. But the question of, are we getting our money's worth? I think that's a negotiation of tuition question looking forward, not an imposition of liability question looking back. And can I jump in for a second? I just saw a question come across the Q&A that's real quick on the question of somebody asked about testing. You could test differently one week from another week. What I mean by a robust system of testing, what I've heard from some of the people doing this planning, would be testing on the orders of once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week. That is a robust testing regimen, and it's not at all clear that that's even possible, given the number of tests that may be able to come online, let alone advisable for other reasons. But what I meant by a robust testing environment is not once on the way in and once before they go home Christmas time. It's got to be much more than that. I was going to say, I think this is actually, as troublesome an issue as this is, I think this is a good issue for our campuses, because this is the whole thicket of issues on which we have something important to say, that we do believe in free expression, and that's our starting position. So we don't silence people because we disagree with their views. We don't even silence people because we think their views have no foundation in fact. However, on universities, we are also committed to the creation of knowledge through a method. I mean, this is nothing new. This goes back to Francis Bacon in the beginning of the modern era and scientific method. So we believe there are ways of having debates, and there are evidence pieces that have to be brought to bear on it. So I think we have something to say about that. We also, as campuses, have a very important role to play in articulating what is the best way to have civil conversation. Does not mean that we restrict people from their means of discussing things other ways. But we model and we articulate, and we're allowed to say things on campus like, this is the highest aspirations of this college and university. So, for example, if an argument is based that has nothing to do with science, a university can say, you're allowed to say that. But we think that's wrong, and we think it's wrong for the following reasons. If somebody thinks that the way that you make an argument is you go up to the State House with a gun and behave in a threatening way, it turns out if you're in a open carry state, you're allowed to do that. But we on this campus think that is a bad way to proceed, and that we think that is not in the highest values of the university. So I think it's actually an opportunity for our educational leaders to be important spokespeople on this issue. I think that's just right. And that heightens the responsibility on decision makers and those who do have a bully pulpit to say that even if there's a right to behave a certain way, it's a right that we on this campus discourage or say it in a much stronger way. So I think, it's an opportunity, and in a time like this, that opportunity creates an obligation. The point, and I know Paul would agree with this, that those restrictions based on health, you've got to make very sure you're doing those in a content neutral manner, that you're applying the same rules. And that's not going to be hard in the idea of not having more than 10 people collecting on campus, that kind of a thing. But you always want to be aware that when you start to articulate a rule in one situation, make sure it's one you're going to be comfortable with in lots of other situations. Well, I think that to a certain extent, there's going to have to be a presumption that a request for an accommodation is going to be met. I mean, I think you're going to have privacy issues that are going to be legitimate from the point of view of staff or faculty if they say, I don't feel safe being back on campus at this time. I think, at least as a starting position, that's going to have to be respected. Obviously, there's going to be a potential for abuse there, so it's hard to have a blanket rule. It's going to have to be evaluated on a somewhat ongoing basis. But I would be loath to start with strict rules of making a case for why one shouldn't have to be coming back to class. I can imagine faculty who will want to say, I can't be back on campus, and I'm not comfortable explaining what my medical condition is that makes that necessary. And I think the better part of valor is going to be providing remote learning opportunities for that faculty member than to cross-examine him or her. I think the research functions are in some ways some of the most disturbing implications of all this. Obviously, there's a lot of focus on anything that's even remotely COVID-19 related. So to that extent, there's been an uptick. But when we close campuses, it's easy to forget that the experiments don't go away. The rats and the Drosophila and all the other ways in which these experiments go forward don't go away. So I think to a large extent, there've been real challenges for many campuses, and there's no reason to think that there's going to be additional federal support on grants. You may get relief in terms of time that you have in order to perform the investigation that you've contracted to do with the government. But I don't think there's any reason to believe that there's going to be additional resources coming. In fact, I think there's every reason to believe that in the non-COVID-19 space, that's going to level off. So I think that the research function for the big research universities is yet another challenge in this. We've talked a lot about tuition income. Obviously, gifts and development are under stress. And in case that's not enough to keep Mary and the rest of us from not sleeping well at night, I think the research dollars that research universities count on is going to be a challenge in the next 6, 12, 18 months as well. Well, first of all, I want to endorse everything that Mary said. And I think in an interesting way, we as university administrators are sometimes loath to say publicly what we don't know. So if there's a silver lining here, the pandemic has created a huge cover for all of us to say what we don't know. If you read Bill Gates' very thoughtful piece on the pandemic, he has a whole section on what we don't know. So, my tradition says, teach thy tongue to say, I do not know. Well, I think this is a pretty good time to put that to use. The other piece of advice that I would give, which is a standard piece of advice in any times of crisis, and that is communicate, communicate, communicate. Push information out at all turns. And it sounds so obvious to do that, but the fact is when you're insecure and you're uncomfortable and you're not sure, it's very tempting to pull in and not to share ideas that are not fully formed. it's understandable. It's a big mistake. Communicating with your students, communicating with your donors, communicating with your board, communicating with your faculty, communicating with your staff. Share your uncertainty, get their feedback. At the end of the day, the president and her team is going to have to make the decisions. We all know that, but you want maximum feedback and you want people to know what it is you're thinking. So 3 most important things are communicate, communicate, communicate.